cast your minds back to the week of the 6th to the 13th of January, and this is where I do this noise, this movement, and the more perceptive movie aware of you will have it here. It's a slight twinkling as we go back in time. That week had actually been quite a tough week for us because we'd had a report about a doctor on the 6th of January, which had then prompted a whole range of outrage from various people in the trans community, some of which was starting to be picked up. And then in the middle of the week, Suzanne Moore had one of her periodic spats, and so off we went, the temperature was rising. So I hadn't really stopped from the previous Sunday, so I got up on the Sunday morning at about 10 o'clock, thinking, oh, a day off, to find on the Observer website an article by Julie Burchill. And after having positioned trans people as having bullied her friend, Suzanne Moore, off Twitter, and complaining that trans women were diverting people from the real feminist cause, she wrote, but they'd rather argue over semantics. To be fair, after having one's nuts taken off, see what I did there, by endless decades in academia, it's all most of them are fit to do. Educated beyond all common sense and honesty, it was a hoot to see the screaming memes accuse Suze of white feminist privilege. It may have been this which made her finally respond in the subsequent salty language she employed to answer her Twitter critics. She, the other JB, and I are part of the tiny minority of women of working class origin to make it in what used to be called Fleet Street, and I think this partly contributes to the standoff with the trannies. We know that everything we have, we got for ourselves. We have no family money, no safety net, and we are damned if we're going to be accused of being privileged by a bunch of bedwetters in bad wigs. It's been noted that before that cyberspace, though supposedly all new and shiny, is plagued by the age-old boredom of men telling women not to talk and threatening them with all kinds of nastiness if they persist in saying what they feel. To have your cock cut off and then plead special privileges as women above natural-born women who don't know the meaning of suffering, apparently, is a bit like the old definition of chutzpah, the boy who killed his parents and then asked the jury for clemency on the grounds he was an orphan. The outcry was enormous and immediate. The Press Complaints Commission, bless them, received over 800 complaints about this piece. The Independent on Sunday ran a poll later that day asking whether Burchill had gone too far. 87% of respondents said yes. The next day, the Observer removed the piece, and in doing so they removed the hundreds of comments which were supporting trans people. John Mulholland also posted an apology, and at 6 o'clock that evening, Monday evening, we thought, phew. Only to go, oh God, at 8:30 when Toby Young republished it on the Telegraph's website, which again resulted in over 100 complaints to the PCC. In the middle of March, 2 months later, the PCC responded, and I'll read part of their adjudication, so sorry for boring you. The Commission first considered the complaints framed under Clause 12 that the article had contained a number of remarks about transgender people that were pejorative and discriminatory. Gosh, really. It noted that the Observer had accepted that these remarks were offensive and that it had made the decision to remove the article on the basis that the language used fell outside the scope of what it considered reasonable. All good so far. However, the Observer denied a breach of Clause 12 because the article had not made reference to any specific individual. Clause 12 states that newspapers must avoid prejudicial or pejorative reference to an individual's race, colour, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or to any physical or mental illness or disability. However, the clause does not cover references to groups or categories of people. Uh-oh. The language in the article did not refer to any identifiable individual, but to transgender people generally. So while the Commission acknowledged the depth of the complainant's concerns about the terminology used, in the absence of reference to a particular individual, there was no breach of Clause 12. The Commission acknowledged that the complainants found much of the article offensive. Nonetheless, the terms of the Editor's Code of Practice do not address issues of taste and offence. Editor's Code of Practice. Clause 5. Intrusion into grief or shock. In cases involving personal grief or shock, inquiries and approaches must be made with sympathy and discretion, and publication handled sensitively. PCC doesn't handle matters of taste and decency. In January 2010, we were completing a survey of trans people. We had 250 trans people complete an online survey on how they experienced the British media. And I'll quote some from this. The verbal abuse reported by respondents was often described as being aggressive, with the implication that some of the respondents felt they might be in physical danger from their abusers. It also frequently involved sexual references, such as demands to see genitals. Several respondents reported that they had endured multiple instances of abuse, and in some cases these incidents were connected, with one referring to a month-long hate crime campaign, which she believed may have been connected to negative stories in the media. Media-related verbal abuse was reporting as occurring at home, in the street, at work, in supermarkets, and even in one instance in a lesbian bar. In total, 21.5% of respondents had experienced verbal abuse that they believed was associated with representations of transgender people in the media on at least one occasion. 8% reported that they had received physical abuse that they believed was connected to an item or items in the media. Poor media reporting has a direct impact on trans people's lives. It can place us in danger. It creates incorrect stereotyping, which can lead to loss of jobs, friends, and family. My own father hasn't spoken to me for 10 years because of the media coverage of trans people and the impression it has given him. And the media coverage has been incessant. In February last year, I gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry on behalf of Trans Media Watch. Robert J. and Lord Justice Leveson kindly listened to me for nearly an hour, giving example after example of poor reporting and the impact it had. Most of the examples were from the preceding year, some from the preceding month, and one from the previous day. We included 10 case studies which we asked to be kept completely confidential because the survivors of those events were terrified of being subjected to further ordeals at the hands of the press. The day before I sat in that famous blue chair, Dominic Moen, editor of The Sun, had been directly challenged over some of the articles and claimed that he was taking steps to remove such reporting from his paper. This, and a subsequent submission after another month of press bullying of trans communities, most notably in The Sun and the Daily Mail, all made an impact on Lord Justice Leveson, who devoted 4 pages of his report to our evidence and condemned the press for unnecessary outings and repeated breaches of their own code. Yet, just 3 weeks after Leveson had reported, the tabloids were at it again, and they outed Lucy Meadows, who had the nerve to transition while being a primary school teacher. Despite the support of the vast majority of parents, teachers, pupils and governors, the press found one parent upon which they could pin outrage. The harassment by journalists and photographers went on for over 2 weeks, even though the articles were done within 3 days. The day before the Press Complaints Commission issued their ruling on the Belcher article, Meadows took her own life, And as Des said, the coroner at the inquest slammed the press for their coverage. The tabloids have leapt on the defence that Meadows made no explicit link between her suicide and the press coverage. But the evidence that surrounded her, including some that we as Transmedia Watch were able to provide to the coroner, indicated that the press coverage had indeed had a substantial effect upon her life and state of mind. Her death has raised some serious questions for the press to answer. At the moment, it's not clear whether they've just decided to go quiet and play nice for a bit, or whether there is some serious soul-searching going on. Trans coverage is a microcosm of press behaviour. David Allen Green has commented that it's how the corporates would exploit anyone if they could. Now the press has been called out again, and blood does not seem that far from their hands. Their behaviour has changed. Is this improvement permanent? Well, I hope so, but we have been here before. We need effective regulation with teeth, and we need a change in culture in editorial offices, a culture which educates and informs rather than just exploits for titillation, a culture that reports things in the public interest rather than a half-baked notion of what the public might be interested in, a culture overall of accuracy, dignity and respect.